Hey everyone, so welcome to the final edition of the part 2 of the Rise of the Roman Republic. And this one is called Rome Goes East or Rome versus Greece, or you can say even kind of the fall of the Greek empires. This is how Rome basically brings down the Hellenic world. And so, kind of explain what was going on. Shortly after the Second Punic War, Rome would be pulled into a conflict called the Second Macedonian War. It was against the ruler of Macedon, which is represented by this maroon color right here. Let me do this. This maroon color right here, which, as you can see, has expanded a little bit since the last map. They were expanding. So were this blue color here, the Seleucids, this dark grayish blue. They were expanding as a result of weakness now of the Ptolemies, which are the yellow, which is another Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt. And during this time, they both had pretty strong leaders. The Seleucids leader was Antigonus III, and he'll come into play in a little bit after the Second Macedonian War. And he quickly took what we now call Israel and Lebanon from the Seleucids, or from the Ptolemies. And so once he did that, he'd kind of merged. He'd also came over here and reconquered Bactria and Parthia, two other important provinces of the Seleucids. So they kind of hit their height under Antiochus III. He kind of restored them back to where they were under the founder Seleucus, who was one of the Diadoches. Similar with Macedon. Macedon had went into decline after Alexander the Great. A lot of Macedonians had immigrated over to the east to other parts of his empire, so they got depopulated. Then they got conquered for a little bit by Epirus. Then you had the situation around when the Galatians, a Celtic tribe, invaded Macedon. They were eventually forced over into Turkey, into the region which we call Galatia, which is over here. You probably remember it from the book of Galatians from the Bible. But so effectively, Macedon had entered a period of decline. Well, Demetrius' son, Antigonus II, who's named after Antigonus I, the Diadochi, he kind of kept them alive, restored them, and then through his family, he had a descendant called Philip V. And Philip V is the ruler of Macedon now. He's the one that fought Rome in the Second Punic War when Rome was fighting Carthage, and he'd kind of started to restore Macedon back to its power. He took over several of the islands, and he took this area called Caria from the Ptolemies, and there's a famous battle of Abydos where he besieged the city. And the men actually, this is a totally different time, actually killed all the women and children and then fought to the better end. Kind of a morbid tale, but he'd slowly started taking over all these areas in what's now Turkey along the coastline. And he was expanding his power. Of course, he had more influence over the Greeks. Well, this purple area, which is Rhodes, this green area, Pergamum, both got bothered by his expansionism, and they allied together against Macedon, and they eventually talked Athens, which is the blue color right here, to join them in this war. And so Macedon started to invade Athens, and Rome heard about it, and both Pergamum and Rhodes had reached out to Rome as well. And Rome initially wasn't going to intervene. They were kind of war-weary from fighting Carthage in the Second Punic War, but eventually they decided to intervene, and they sent troops over to save Athens, and basically over here. They also eventually talked the Aetolians, which is this yellow color. Remember them from the last video, because they fought Macedon in the last video. But this group, it's like another Greek city league, joined with Athens, Pergamum, and Rhodes, and they all agreed to fight Macedon. And so there was heavy battles throughout. Rome did a lot of positioning around here, where they would ally out the Illyrians, and the two of them kind of fought over the different Illyrian tribes north of Macedon. Eventually, they would meet Philip V, and I'm trying to find this battle name. So they meet him, and I'm going to butcher this, but there's a battle called Cynoscephalia, and kind of to lead up to the battle, there was a leader who Rome kind of changed consuls 3 or 4 times. They had brought some troops over that were veterans from the Carthaginian War, and they were hesitant to go in the battle. They got kind of war-weary. They eventually got Flaminius, who's a famous, he really liked Greek culture and famous Roman leader, and he would play a big part in the Greek wars and getting Greece on help the Romans, and the Greeks to help the Romans. And so they agreed. He led them into a couple battles where they defeated Philip V. Notably, he defeated Philip in the Battle of Sinope, which was a decisive Roman victory that proved the Roman legion was stronger than the Macedonian phalanx. And so he was able to defeat the Macedonian army at its height. And so it's kind of like, partly because the Roman legions were more maneuverable around the hills, they were able to get around and flank the Greek phalanx, which I kind of explained in the first video about Alexander and how it all worked. And so it's kind of the series, it kind of shows Rome's superiority, Roman legion superiority to the Greek phalanx units, the pikemen. And so after defeating them, Macedon was basically forced out of all its gains. So it was limited basically. Okay. They lost that. They lost this island, which taking that island was kind of a big part of the war as well. Corinth went over to the Achaean League. Athens kind of survived. And this area, Caria, went over to Rhodes. I think Pergamum kind of expanded as well. Maybe took like some of these islands up here. So Rome's allies came out victorious. Macedon was severely weakened. Philip V, basically he had abandoned all the lands outside of Macedon proper. He was limited to an army of 5,000 troops, and he could not get his army out of Macedon without approval of Rome. So Rome put pretty harsh terms, severely nerfed Macedon. It was basically no longer a threat to the rest of Greece. And Flaminius very famously declared, I think it was in Athens, the freedom of the Greeks. And so all the Greek nations now helped Rome and sided with Rome. And so they kind of had the Roman legions pulled out of Greece, left Greece to its own accord. Well, one of the leagues that kind of got frustrated with Rome was the Aetolian League. And they had, I'm fixing this while I'm talking. The Aetolian League really got upset with Rome off hostage exchange, where Rome 1,000 people from the Aetolian League and refused to return them at the Aetolian League. So they kind of kept them as hostages. And so that angered him. So the Aetolian League started to fight Rome. Well, Antiochus III got very ambitious, and during this time, he had also started to expand. During the war with Macedon, he had briefly invaded Pergamum. Rome had sent emissaries, and he abandoned Pergamum. He declared neutrality in this war. Well, he was kind of expanding a little bit. I'm going to kind of put this up to the Hellespont, which I talked about in that last video of Persia, which is up here. And he had kind of expanded into Thrace, kind of taken this lower part of Thrace where Byzantium is. So this area had been taken by the Seleucids. And the Seleucids thought, this is our chance to come in and basically restore most of Alexander's empire, because zooming out on the map, you can see how massive they are. They're almost stretching from India all the way over here to Greece. And Antiochus III wanted to show he's the next, basically, Alexander the Great. He had been winning battle after battle. So he thought, I'm going to invade Greece. And he also hired a outcast general from Carthage called Hannibal. I think you guys remember Hannibal. And this angered Rome as well. So Pergamum, Rhodes, which is purple and green, as well as the Romans, didn't like this. So Rome declared war on the Seleucid Empire, and this would be called the Roman-Syrian War. And the Aetolian League, which is this yellow color, allied with the Seleucids, while the Achaeans, orange, Macedon, ironically led by Philip V, Pergamum, and Rhodes all allied against the Seleucids. And I want to kind of remove Athens at this point because they're not really relevant to the story anymore. But so these different leagues all ally with Rome, other than the Yellow League, which allies with the Seleucids. And the Seleucids come down here and they meet the Romans at Thermopylae. Thermopylae is famous because that's where Sparta defeated the Persians. And the Seleucid leader knew that, and they were trying to lure the Romans into a similar battle. It didn't work out. The Romans were not the Persians. They were able to outmaneuver and destroy the Seleucid army pretty easily. And Rome had been panicking at this point. It's been about maybe 10 years or 11 years after Hannibal, in the Second Punic War. And they were all, here you got this massive empire that can mobilize a lot of men, and they got Hannibal in their service and the famed Antiochus III. And they're thinking this is going to be a very serious war. Well, the Battle of Thermopylae shows that maybe the Seleucid army is really not up to snuff, and that would prove to be very much true. And for the first time in Roman history, Romans, they, of course, we take Thrace, they go into Asia. They actually step on the Asian continent, and they fight a battle somewhere in this area of Turkey called the Battle of Magnesia. And at this battle, it's a blowout. Rome just smashes the Seleucid army and Antiochus III. The Seleucids are just not up to par. The Romans are superior. Rome and its string of allies easily hand it to them. And the Seleucids never recover after this. They never recover. I'll get that in a minute. The one kind of note is that Hannibal was put in charge of a fleet. He was actually made an admiral, which kind of limited his skill. And he fought in the Romans at the sea battle and along the Hellespont. He lost the sea battle, and I think he ended up committing suicide. And that's kind of the ending career for Hannibal. Well, after the Seleucids are defeated, basically they split up what they called Asia at the time, which is now Turkey. This whole chunk up here goes to Pergamum, and by this time the Ptolemies are gone as well. Then this whole point right here, let me make sure I do this, goes to Rhodes. And effectively all the Asian territories for the Seleucids are gone. And Rome, the Roman Republic, I'm going to kind of put this as goes to, I think, another country, what's it called, Cappadocia. And so what's effectively the Seleucids are weakened so bad they'll never recover. They start to lose wars against another country over here called Parthia. So they lose basically contact with what we call modern-day Afghanistan, which was called the Greek Bactrian Kingdom, or Bactria. So all these lands over here, effectively gone. I'm just going to go ahead and do this too, even though I'm not sure if they were gone at that time or not. So his entire, he dies actually out there fighting, trying to restore his empire out in this region. And this area will slowly, I'm going to use pink, Parthia. I really want to do purple because purple is used a lot in games for him. But this becomes Parthia and it rebels. And it'll be important because it's eventually going to, I might as well draw it. It's eventually going to go on. Let me do Rhodes as pink. How about that? So we don't have two purples. And then we got Rhodes as, jeez. So eventually Parthia, mouse has been messed up. I need a new mouse. Okay. Parthia would go on to conquer. I'm just going to go ahead and do this, even though it would take them a while to get this far over, but they would go on and conquer eventually most of what we call the Seleucid Empire in the east. So they'd be mostly limited to the Syria region. Of course, they get involved in the Hanukkah story and a bunch of other stuff, but they're no longer really a player at this point. I might as well, you know what? I might as well do this. You know, to show you're such a loser, you're not a player anymore. I'm just gonna go. Okay, so they're no longer a player. So Seleucids never recover from the Roman-Syrian War, and they end up eventually getting conquered. Actually, they do get conquered by the Romans finally, but a lot of their lands fall to Parthia. Coming back over here into Greece in this situation. So Rome has now just defeated the two biggest of the Greek states and with their best leaders. And Rome just seems unstoppable at this point. Effectively, Macedon's Philip V's son, Demetrius, decides to start trouble again. He thinks he can defeat Rome, and he tries to find allies. Doesn't find a whole lot. Perseus, I'm sorry, not Demetrius, Perseus is his name. He actually starts winning in early parts of the war. The Roman army is very disorganized. They underestimate him. They lose several battles here. But eventually they catch him in a battle called Pinda, which is an old capital of Macedon. And once again, the Roman legions emerge victorious over the Macedonian hoplites. And the phalanx collapses on an uneven ground, once again using the hills. The Romans are able to defeat him. At this point, Macedon is effectively broken into a bunch of different territories. But you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put it as Roman because these territories are effectively designed to be Roman subservient states. But there will be one more war with Macedon. But at this point, Macedon it's 4 different countries. Well, a usurper comes along. His name is Andriascus, and he claims to be a descendant of Philip and a bunch of the Macedonian leaders. And once again, the Rome emerges victorious, and they defeat him. Meanwhile, during the interim, the Achaean League basically fought and conquered Sparta, and Rome kind of helped them a little bit with this. So Sparta's out of the picture. And for a little bit, they even briefly took over Athens. So the Achaean League is basically the big dogs in Greece, but they're not that strong in the scheme of things. Rhodes is basically made into a satellite state of Rome. So Rome starts expanding here. They actually defeated the Galatians in a battle after defeating the Seleucids. It's made them popular in Asia because the Galatians were kind of like a piracy problem. So as you can see, the Romans are now, there's nobody in Greece really to threaten them. The Achaean League decided to do one last war. It's called the Achaean War. And it's basically them revolting against Rome. And it's a massacre. People called it a suicidal war even at the time. One thing of note in this war, Rome had also gone to war with Carthage over here. And there was a famous Roman orator called Cato. And he famously announced every Senate meeting by saying Carthage must be destroyed. He opened every debate. It could be talking about public water works or fire in the civilian quarter. It had nothing to do with Carthage. But every speech he ever made in the Senate, he kept saying Carthage must be destroyed. Well, Carthage had been put under very tight terms for Rome, and honestly, the Carthage is probably a little bit bigger than what they were. They'd gotten shrunk even down. They were mostly limited to this area of land, but I'll make it easier when I flip it all to red. But and basically, it's the Rome picked one of the worst reasons to go war with Carthage. A Numidian tribe invaded Carthage, ransacked it, and then retreated back. It was basically like a raiders, a piracy. Well, Carthage invaded Numidia to try to stop them. Rome said, "You broke the treaty. Numidia is our ally. Will you agree to not step out of your border unless you have our approval?" And Rome went to war with Carthage. Interestingly, Carthage held out pretty well in the Third War, all things considering, but they had a little bit of trouble. But once again, Rome burnt Carthage down. And the year 146 BC, which is when I wanted to end the first series, Rome destroyed both the city of Corinth, which was the capital of the Achaean League, utterly destroyed the city, and Carthage. Same year, 2 different wars, 2 different sides of the Mediterranean. Greece, after the Achaean War, was lumped in with the Macedonians and were made an official Roman province. Epirus was also included in that too. So now Rome rules Greece. They did give some autonomy to Sparta and Athens, I believe, but Rome effectively now rules the Greeks. And they ruled Carthage. And a leader of Pergamum died without an heir, Attalus. I think it was Attalus. Was that the last one? Or I can't remember his name. And he deeded the kingdom of Pergamum to Rome as well. So, bam, they went to Rome. So now you can see Rome has total control of the Greek world. And it's now officially Roman provinces. Rome also has taken out Carthage. You look around the Mediterranean now, and at this point they'd also kind of taken most of Illyria as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So if you're keeping tabs, I could probably even argue they own all this area, isn't that? Because this is Nabataeum. I think they kind of took more. They've been fighting over here in Spain as well, and they've taken probably. I'm just going to add a lot more of their Spanish Empire. So at this point, you're starting to see southern Gaul, Spain, Africa, Greece, Turkey. They're all over the place, and they don't really have a rival anymore. They are now the superpower dominating the Mediterranean. There's no threats. Egypt's still around, but they're in decay. Parthia is over here is kind of an emerging power. Rome would fight a lot of wars with them. The Seleucids are their dying bread, their deathbed. The Seleucids are on their deathbed. You got Pontus up here, which I'm going to go ahead and put them on the map because they will play a part. Them and Armenia will fight Rome in a kind of the next big war, but I don't really want to get a whole lot into it. They would actually expand all the way into Greece. This is Pontus right here, north. It's like kind of like the northeastern part of Turkey. You got them, and you got, let's say, the Armenians, which Armenia still exists today, but today it's a lot smaller than what it was back then. Armenians have lost a lot of land in history. Kind of sad for them, but must have not had. You got Armenia and Pontus, and they'll threaten Rome during the next big conflict. Oh, I didn't do that. Man, Armenia is really threatening. Armenia would actually, at its height, even take over Syria and defeat the Seleucids for a short span. But so this is kind of what the world looks like. These areas right here, which is Cappadocia, Bithynia, I think there's Galatia, kind of Syria, which is the Seleucids. Israel get its independence. They're ruled by the Maccabees, so the Jewish state. They're all kind of like buffer states right now, but Rome will eventually take them over. And Thrace is kind of a Roman ally, so I almost could do red up here as well. And really, they've come in, they've started taking over this area also. So let me just do this for right now. This area is kind of Roman as well. So they've defeated the Illyrians. They've got Thrace as an ally. Maybe I'll do this for Roman ally. And that Thrace would be an ally for quite a while until the Augustus era. I think they eventually, Rome just decided to make them a province later on. But the Thracians are pretty much Romanized and under Rome as well. In fact, a lot of these states now, even the ones over here in Turkey, are really starting to be subservient to Rome at this point. They would still be independent de facto, but yeah, they're starting to be taken over. And probably more in North Africa. There would be the Numidian War as well. Take over a lot of Algeria and Morocco. But yeah, 146 BC is kind of the height of the Roman Republic in my series. And so at this point, when I get to the next series, I'm going to start getting into decline and fall of the Roman Republic. And like a lot of states, and we're probably dealing with this in the United States as well, is once a nation hits its high water mark, they get complacent, they get lazy, they start fighting each other rather than focusing on their enemy. And you're going to see that a lot. The political rivalry in Rome is going to match. Actually, it's worse than what modern America, because we don't assassinate. At least in theory, we don't assassinate other politicians and stuff. But things are going to get pretty bad in the Republic in the years to come that I'm going to follow in the next series. And you get the Gracchi brothers. I'm going to start out with that. You get some of the famous orators like Cicero. I'll give in to Cato. They're around. You've got Sulla and Marius, and they fight a bloody civil war. They're kind of the first demagogues of the Roman Republic. And out of them, like one of the generals for Sulla is Pompey Maximus. You get Pompey, and then you get Julius Caesar, who also kind of grew up as a child. Marius and Sulla were fighting over Rome under Sulla's tyrannical regime. And so then you get Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in the first triumvirate. Then, of course, Julius Caesar's death and the second triumvirate of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. And, of course, Octavian becomes Augustus Caesar, and that's the end of he ends the Republic. But we're heading that direction. We're heading towards a lot of political instability. Rome was going to fight a lot of civil wars. Not sure how I'm going to depict on the map. I may not even bother doing it, but on the map anymore, because the map, I kind of wanted to use the map to show Rome taking out its enemies. But gone are Carthage, gone are the Greeks, the two major threats to Rome, the major other powers of the Mediterranean. So the Hellenic world, sadly, the last vestige of the Hellenic world and Alexander's empire would not be Egypt. Egypt does live on until Cleopatra. Cleopatra is famously the last ruler. And you could argue that some of these states that are still in Turkey are Greekish, but the last actual Greek stronghold, which actually would last till after Jesus' death, even after Jesus' death, and into like I think the 2nd century AD, you'd have the Greek Bactrian kingdom over here in Afghanistan, and then they would actually invade and take over parts of India for a time. They call the Indo-Greek kingdom. Of course, they found Greek coinage in India citing to these leaders, and that's how we know they're there. There's like writings about them, Greek coinage, all of this. So the Greeks' last vestige would be in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Ironically, the last of the Greek states, because most of the Greek world in the West is going to fall under Rome. That's the end of this series. A lot of distractions because my cat's driving me crazy, my dog's driving me crazy. Hopefully, didn't come off too much in this video. As you saw, the Macedonians fall to the Romans. The wars were really not. They had a little bit of trouble in the Third Macedonian War. That's that second one when Perseus, which is Philip V's son, rose up against him. But these wars really weren't. Rome was never truly threatened. Not like the Second Punic War with Hannibal. The Seleucids, they were really nervous about them. The Senate panicked when they went to war, and they ended up just being it was a blowout. The Seleucids did not stand a chance against the Romans, and despite having this massive state that had most of Alexander's empire, they just never recovered. And the part of the problem with the Greeks were, as you saw, Rome played the divide and conquer game, and the Greeks never were united. They were more interested in fighting each other and breaking up their other Greek threats, and they were facing the Romans. And by the time groups like the Aetolian and Achaean League started realizing Rome was a threat, there was no Macedon to help them. There was no Seleucid Empire to help them. They were on their own, and they didn't stand a chance against the Roman legions. There was not a situation. I think the Achaean League famously jumped into the Achaean War. Well, there's 149 BC, thinking, oh, maybe we might have that off chance that we could stop them like we did Persia. Our ancestors did Persia, but the Romans weren't the Persians. I'll put it that way. They defeated Sparta. They defeated the Achaeans. Greeks were just, at this point, the Greeks were not the same. And the Roman military was far superior than Persia ever put together. And they could outmaneuver, outmanage the Greeks, and it just never was much of a contest. Pergamum and Rhodes both later on started to drift away from Rome, but by that point it was too late, and they realized they had no chance. So the Greeks really kind of fell into the Romans. And then when they became a Roman province, the Romans the area became very prosperous, and so they had no reason to revolt against the Romans. They were bringing them wealth. They united Greece, and it was now a place of peace and trade and prosperity. And interestingly, the last vestige of the Roman Empire, deep in the Middle Ages, would be in the Greek region. They would outlive the Italian part of the Roman Empire. So the Greeks really incorporated very well into the Roman world, and the areas of Greece was under Roman rule longer than Italy was, if you count the Byzantine Empire. So, yeah, a lot going on with that, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. Just wanted to finish out the high point of Rome and its conquest and its wars. The series will get less about wars moving forward and more about the politics, and we're heading in that direction. So I'll have to do a lot of research and think about how to do the next series, but I want to get into the fall of the Roman Republic and to some of the stories that everybody's familiar with. You're going to hear Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian, and a lot of you're going to start getting, especially in the later part of that story, a lot into the stories that everybody we've made movies about, and people, the parts of Rome people remember. The classic period of the Roman Republic, the heyday, ends in that 146 BC when Rome smashes Corinth, and Carthage totally destroys the cities. Of course, Carthage, famously, they poured salt after they burnt the city down so that nothing could grow there again. But, once it was done, it was to send a message. They're now the rulers of the Mediterranean, and they're unchallenged.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the Roman Republic series. I just want to do kind of one other. I did this video a day later after I filmed the original one. I had some distractions. I had the dog and the cat living around me that kind of making noise in the background. That kind of, I'd lose my train of thought a few times. I'll probably be able to edit a lot of that out though. Sometimes I even repeated what I said, knowing I was going to edit it out at the time. But I just kind of want to get into. Yeah, I feel like I rushed that one maybe a little bit, and kind of the Second Punic War as well. But there's a lot to that, and it's hard to get into. Kind of a call out that it is kind of an interesting time period. It deals with the collapse of the Greeks. One thing I didn't bring up, I kind of wish I'd dove a little more, was the Seleucid Empire, and I kind of loosely reference how Rome panicked, and it's about 10 or 15 years after the Second Punic War, but they were really worried because it was the biggest of the Hellenic states. It was, you could see on the map, it was stretched from Turkey all the way to India, and kind of represented the high power of Alexander's empire, and it had been in decline prior to this leader called Antiochus III, which is kind of where the city Antioch gets its name, because at the front end of his name has that. And I think Antiochus I was Seleucid, who's the founder of that dynasty's son, and they had kind of slowly been declining, and then he came along and he was a great general. He started uniting the empire, and he defeated the Ptolemies and took what's now Israel and Lebanon, which one of his sons would be the one that would persecute the Jews during Hanukkah. And I did a video with Pete on his channel, the other channel, Pantry Pirates, which is the sister channel of this. You can kind of go watch that one if it's just focused on Hanukkah and everything around that. But I kind of get into him on that as well and what all happened. But yeah, with the Seleucids, them losing the Turkish area, which was Greek. Turkey was Greek at the time. There was no Turks there. Turks came during the medieval ages, but they lost a lot of their manpower they can pull to operate their phalanx. They also had a huge penalty, currency wise, that Rome would put on them, and they always had a hard time controlling their vast territories to the east because traveling out there was very difficult. One of the reasons Rome never took over what's now modern day Iran, because logistics around it made it very difficult for them to communicate with, areas that are like what's now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan that were part of their empire. And so those areas were always kind of autonomous. And of course, the Greek Bactrian Kingdom was a break off of the Seleucid Empire. But so that kind of started their decline, and Parthia came along and ended up defeating them. And you've heard about the Parthians. They'll be around throughout Rome's history, the first half of Roman history in the Empire era. So they started losing a lot of ground on that. So that was kind of the end of them. And I wanted to kind of go more into that, but they ended up having a lot of civil wars as well. But kind of the whole theme around the Greeks is their failures to unite. You kind of get like the last Achaean War, you did have an alliance that included Athens, Sparta. Sparta was heavily declined by that point. There were nothing like the Sparta that people think of. Argos, Corinth, the city of Achaia itself, Olympia, it had Megapolis, it had a lot of the big Greek city-states in it. And they were just no match for the Romans. It showed you how well advanced the Romans were, and in some ways the Macedonians as well. And one thing I kind of like to point out in my series, because it's kind of a gap in history, you hear a lot about Sparta and Athens. You don't hear really as much as you should about Macedon. And Macedon was kind of the big player in Greek history. That the Hellenic era does not get studied much. Who knows the Seleucid Empire or the Ptolemaic Egypt? Very few people have heard those names. They were great powers at their time, and so and they spread Greek. Part of the reason Greek culture spread across the world was thanks to Macedon and Alexander and his later descendants. Military formation wise, the Macedonians would put them up in Thermopylae against Sparta. That they win. They handily defeat the Spartans. They were the Silver Shields of Macedon were probably the greatest Greek military formation ever, along with especially tied to the companion cavalry that Alexander did. And the Seleucids were very interesting because they're, playing with them. And like if I play in video games, so they mix. They have war elephants. They have Persian light cavalry. They got Macedonian phalanx. They got the companion cavalry. They got all the best military formations of the Greek world, including the Scythe chariot, which is famous in Ben-Hur, the one, the one that the guy does that the bad guy in it. I can't remember his name, but the one that Ben-Hur hates. That's what a Scythe chariot is. Those blades coming out the wheels. They would use, but they would actually make them longer in battle, and they'd could cut people's feet off. They were a big threat. But they would, the Seleucids could blend all kinds of the best of Alexander's military strategy, plus stuff Alexander learned from his enemies, and Rome still defeated them and defeated them pretty handily, shockingly in that war. But Macedonian culture and what they did, you always hear about Sparta and Athens. You never hear people talk much about Macedon, but they were the premier power of Greece. And once Macedon went under, you see the Greeks didn't stand a chance because the Romans after Macedon was gone. And the only way the Greeks could have beaten Rome is if they should have allied with the Macedonians. But then again, the Macedonians had been tyrants over the Greeks as well. They had tried to rule them as usurpers, and in the long run, in a lot of ways, the Greeks preferred the Roman rule over Macedonian rule, and they had been able through leagues and stuff to keep Macedon off of them. Partly because Macedon was divided. You saw you had a Seleucian Empire, you had a Ptolemaic Empire. The Macedonian Empire was broken up as well, and they weren't working together. And so you kind of got the Macedonian world and the Greek world, and the Macedonians were always trying to dominate the rest of the Greeks, and that was even from the time of Philip and Alexander. And the rest of the Greeks saw the Romans as kind of an out to help them get the Macedonians off of them. But at the same time, you were trading Macedon for Rome, and Rome treated the Greeks kind of like they kept every one of these wars. They would make them weaker, but they wouldn't directly own them. They were fine with letting them be independent countries until they finally got fed up and said, okay, after multiple revolts by Macedon, they said, okay, you're a Roman province. And Rome reacted to a lot of countries that way. One, that Rome was notorious for imposing in the early years very harsh peace terms on their opponents, but at the same time not directly ruling their opponents, allowing them to continue on. What they would do is they would defang them, demilitarize them, make them weaker, where if Rome had to fight them again, it would be a lot easier war. But they didn't directly rule them. And you start seeing after the Macedonian Wars at 146 BC is noteworthy because they finally made all of Greece a Roman province. They made Africa, where Carthage is, a Roman province after the Third Punic War. And so you start seeing them directly start owning the lands that they were fighting against versus just weakening them. And I always wondered if the U.S. eventually goes in that direction where instead of like coming in and putting a puppet government in Iraq, if one day they're like, okay, I'm going to make Iraq a U.S. territory and put a U.S. governor in charge because I'm sick of all the, basically what it is, Rome got sick of all the wars kept popping up and they're like, okay, we're going to solve this problem by directly ruling you guys. And there's always been a theory of me if the U.S. ever gets tired and says, okay, I'm tired of all these wars, I'm going to solve the problem, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, I'm going to make you U.S. territories and put U.S. governors in charge and make you become American. Because that's the direction Rome is going after the Macedonian Wars. And I felt to call that out too, because it's a shift in how Rome interacts with the world. Yeah, they'd taken other territories like Sicily or Sardinia or Spain, but they were like, to Rome, unsettled, uncivilized territories. But when they start taking Greece and Africa in that 146 BC, like I said, that's another shift. Rome goes from weakening to direct owning their opponents, and they never step back after that. The Reds only just going to splatter all over the map. They're going to eventually take what's now all of Turkey. They're going to go into Syria. They actually are the ones that end the Seleucid state because at this point it's only limited to what's now modern Syria, and it's constantly in state of chaos because there's civil wars every time they have a new ruler. And Rome just says, okay, I'm tired of the instability. It's Pompey that actually takes Syria, and he goes and takes Israel at the same time. That's when he famously entered the Holy of Holies in the temple. But Egypt, that eventually happens with Augustus. He eventually takes direct control of Egypt, makes it a Roman province after he gets rid of Cleopatra. Up until then, the Romans were content to let the Ptolemies rule because the Ptolemies actually allied with Rome. Even at the early point, they become like almost a Roman ally / vassal. Rome treats allies like they're vassals. I'll be blunt, and they did that with Rhodes. That's how Rhodes got taken over. One day it became a vassal ally first. Pergamum same way. Thrace same way. They slowly you're an ally first, then you're a client state, and then you're directly owned. I mean, that's how they even approached Italy. A lot of Italy was, even though it's considered red Roman during the Punic Wars, it was considered more not directly Roman. They gave them some autonomy, and you see that the Bible is a great example of that. You see that with, you have King Herod, who's a local ruler, but the Romans still rule. And so yeah, that's kind of how they're interacting with the world. So this does also reflect a shift in how Rome's interacting with the world in this video. But kind of want to call out, this was kind of the downfall of the Greeks and the Macedonians and their world. And you had Carthage with the Punic War. So Rome has now overcome the two big real threats, Rome and or Carthage and Greece. And now it's, the Gauls are kind of a threat too, the Celtic tribes, but just like the Greeks, they're not united. I mean, they're hundreds of tribes fighting each other, and Gaul will eventually be taken over by Julius Caesar, famously, but Spain slowly, Sulla and Marius, a bunch of them start taking more and more of Spain. But yeah, you'll see that, and Parthia becomes kind of the final enemy of Rome, and they never quite conquer them. They do make them at times a client or an allied state, but they never fully take them over. But partly because of how remote Iraq and Iran were to the Roman Empire at that time. They were too far away from their logistics line. They did take over Iraq briefly. What we now call Iraq is called Mesopotamia back then. But the problem with Iraq from the mountains of Iran, it's easy for anybody from Iran to invade and take over Iraq. There's not a lot of defensive positions there. So they'd often abandon it because of the hit, and then taking Iran. They talked about it because the Greeks had done it, but they never went. They never really took over Iran and never went on to India like Alexander did. And the Seleucid Empire tried to rule Iran and Iraq and all that, and they did for like 200 or 300 years, but it was a logistical strain on them throughout their entire existence. But yeah, that's kind of some additions I wanted to add to this video. I felt like I was kind of rushed, but you got 146 BC, the high point of the Republic, the shift in how Rome's gone from weakening to directly owning territories, and that doesn't stop. They take out the Numidians, they take Algeria, Morocco, they take out the Celts, Spain, Gaul, they take out Pontus, they'll take out Armenia, they'll take out the Seleucid Empire, take Syria and all that, take out Egypt. They'll eventually go and take in all the whole Mediterranean coastline. But yeah, and they still had client states, Armenia, Arabia. They never truly fully ruled them. There's groups in Ukraine, Sarmatia, and Scythia, and all that stuff. They actually kind of ruled them. Nubia, which is like modern Sudan, they fought them a lot. Actually, the Nubian queen defeated them, and they made like an alliance. And that they didn't really have them as a client, but they when they made the alliance with them, either side threatened each other again. They were kind of like trade partners for the rest of Roman history. That's more the imperial era. But yeah, yeah, lot of shift. You're now seeing the shift where the Republic, even though the Republic still has maybe 100 more years, it's 100 more years of actual existence. It's starting to look more like the Roman Empire than the Roman Republic was, and you'll start seeing the breakdown of democracy, the breakdown in the systems, and that's going to be the focus of where this series is going to go. That the personalities, you'll get into the big name Roman leaders that everybody knows about, and you'll get into but it's going to be. I want to focus heavily on their breakdown in their system and how the Republic falls apart, but and becomes the Roman Empire itself.